record. And if you have your Biblia BHS, your Hebrew Bible, Boker Tov, Emily, you can follow along. And if you are totally new or have no Hebrew, then you can maybe follow along at least in the English translation. Okay? May the Lord bless the reading of his word. We're in Genesis 18. Vayera elav Adonai, but Elone Mamre, Vuhu Yoshev Petach ha-ohel, V'chom hayom. Verse 2. Vayasa enav vayar, vahine shelosha anashim nitzavim alav, vayar vayarotz likratam mipetach ha-ohel, vayishtachu artza. Verse 3. Vayomar Adonai im na matzati chen be'enecha al na ta'avor me'al avdecha. Yukach na ma'at mayim barachatzu raglechem v'hisha'anu tachat ha'etz. Verse 5. Ve'ekecha fat lechem v'sa'adu libechem achar ta'avoru ki al kain avartem al avdechem. Vayomeru kain ta'aseh ka'asher debarta. Okay, I'll stop there and going back to translate to verse 1. Yahweh appeared to him. So we're talking about Abraham. We're picking up, by the way, there's the covenant story right before this in chapter 17, Abraham and the circumcision covenant. So Yahweh appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre. Now he was sitting at the opening of the tent in the heat of the day. Verse 2, and he lifted his eyes and he looked, and look, 3 men were standing beside him, or they must be at some distance because of what comes next. And he looked and he ran to meet them from the opening of the tent. And he bowed down to the ground. And he said, my Lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass by from across your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And let me get a little bread, and satisfy your heart. After you may pass, for this reason you have passed by your servant. And they said, okay, do according to your word. Do as you've said. Okay, verse 6. Vayimaher Avraham ha'ohela el Sarah. Vayomer Mahari Shalosh Se'im Kemach Solet Lushi Va'asi Ugot. Verse 7. Ve'el Habakar Ratz Avraham. Vayakach ben Bakar Rach Batov Vayatain el Hana'ar Vayamaher La'asot Oto. Verse 8. Vayakach Chem'a V'chalav Uven Habakar Asher Asa Vayatain Lifnehem V'hu Omed Alehem Tachat Ha'etz Vayochelu. Okay, translating starting back in 6. And Avraham hastened or hurried to the tent to Sarah, and he said, hurry up, 3 seahs of fine flour need. So hurry up, need 3 seahs of fine flour, and or maybe measures a seah. We can talk about that. And make cakes, or maybe flatbread. And he ran to the cattle, or to the herd. Abraham ran to the herd, and he took a young calf, tender and good, and he gave it to the young man, and he hurried to prepare it. And he took chema. I'm from Wisconsin, so I like these 2 words, chema and chalav, curds, cheese curds, everybody, curds and milk. So it's like maybe sour milk, actually, 2 different stages of milk. And the young calf, which he had prepared, and he gave, and he set it before them. And he was standing beside them under the tree, and they ate. All right, verse 9. Vayomeru elav, aye Sarah ishtecha, vayomer hine vaohel, vayomer shov ashuv elecha ke'et chaya, vahine vein l'Sarah ishtecha, v'Sarah shoma'at petach ha'ohel v'hu acharav. And verse 11, Va'avraham v'Sarah zakenim ba'im ba'yamim chadal la'yot l'Sarah orach kanashim. In verse 12, Vatitzchak Sarah Bekir ba lemor achere voloti hayatali edna ba'adoni zakein. Okay, stopping there, translating from verse 9. They said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "Look, in the tent." And he said, "I will certainly return to you." Is kayet chaya is like at the time of life, but it's an idiom for probably for like this time next year. And look, a son to Sarah. So Sarah will have Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now, Sarah was listening from the opening of the tent, and it was behind him. The story is really concerned about where everybody is standing. And now Abraham, and also Avraham and Sarah were old. They're like, they were coming into the days. So they were getting old, prolonged in days. And it had ceased to be to Sarah the way of women. A funny way of saying she wasn't able to get pregnant any longer. And verse 12, and Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after it's like my being worn out, is there to be to me pleasure? And my master, talking about Abraham, is old. Okay, verse 13, we are actually going to take a break in between this chapter to talk. So I think we're going to read one more section, then we'll pause, because it's a good pausing spot. Okay, verse 13. Vayomer Adonai el Avraham, lama se tzachaka Sarah lemor ha'af umnam eled va'ani zakanti hayapale medonai davar lamo ed ashuv elecha ka'et chaya u'l'Sarah vain. V'techachesh Sarah lemor lo tzachakti ki yareya. Vayomer lo ki tzachakt. Okay, verse 13 translating. And the Lord said to Abraham, why is this that Sarah laughed, saying, will it truly be that I will give birth, and I am old? Is anything too wonderful or too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you, this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Now Sarah lied, saying, I didn't laugh, because she was afraid. And he said, no, you did laugh. The end of that story. Okay, it certainly goes on, but I think this is the right breaking place, and it's kind of a long chapter. So let's have a little discussion. Any observations or questions? You can ask grammatical questions or exegetical questions, or maybe just making observations about the story here.
I have two.
Okay, good.
Well, one of them is a Hebrew word question. Chem'ah, I thought was butter. It's curds, or is there something in the language there?
Chem'ah is it's like soured milk.
Okay.
That doesn't sound like too appetizing. And so, but I think that's why it's usually taken to be kind of a curdled milk,
Okay.
which could relate to butter. Butter is churned,
Right.
but probably more some sort of cheese-like substance.
Okay. So the other ones, it kind of relates to parables that I was wondering about. I was trying to make notes because I usually think of stuff and forget.
Yeah.
Whenever it says that Abraham, he ran to meet them, I couldn't help but think about the prodigal son at the end of the story, whenever the father runs to meet. I don't know that there's any relationship, but the one that of particular interest was she took 3 measures of fine flour, and it's Matthew 13. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who took and hid in 3 measures of flour leaven, and it became all leavened. And it's I just can't help but think those may be related stories, or at least pointing to the beginning of things. I don't know.
Yeah, that's good. I hadn't thought about the connection with Matthew. The prodigal son story does have a really clear tie to a Jacob Esau story that we probably won't get to for months. But it's a clear parallel to Esau running and embracing Jacob. I think it's at Genesis 33, and they weep, and Jacob is preparing to return. And there's a really clear. But here, perhaps something along certainly running. Abraham is in a hurry in this whole story, and he's just showing something about his character of showing hospitality and with a lot of urgency.
Yeah.
There is perhaps a connection with Hebrews 13 and the entertaining angels text here. Who these men are is at issue, and hospitality. Abraham doesn't know who they are, and in some ways we have a hard time knowing who they are, at least until the story reveals it a bit more. But I think Hebrews 13 is probably picking up on this story.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, good questions or observations. Cool. Others? This whole positioning of where people are, the story is especially concerned with saying, now Abraham was sitting in front of the tent, the opening of the tent. The people are far off. There's a tree far off. He's running to them. Sarah is in earshot of everything that's going on. She's sort of hidden, and she's speaking to herself. And then it's a question of like, when she says, I didn't laugh, or she asked this question, am I gonna have a kid even though I'm old? It's all sort of like, it seemed like she's saying it to herself, and so even denying it to herself, and it's important because she was afraid. That's an important connection with some of these other stories. But then also yes, you did laugh. So we saw in chapter 17 where Abraham laughs, although we don't have this seems much more negative, like Sarah showing her disbelief, whereas Abraham does the same, but it's just sort of side story for the origin of Isaac's name.
It's interesting because if Sarah wasn't allowed and talking to all these people where it could be heard, and she's like, no, I didn't do that, and it was just sort of internal dialogue, however you want to say it. I'm reminiscent of whenever Jesus is saying he knew what they were thinking in their hearts.
Yeah. Right.
In a sense that could be another one of those ways of saying he is God in the flesh, because only God really can tell what's going on in the heart. I don't know. I mean, maybe it came in my head.
Well, there is this issue in this story and a lot of the patriarchal stories when God's identity or Yahweh's identity is cloaked or hidden somehow. I mean, he's showing there's these three guys that stand up or together and show up. And then there's this one, and it's interesting, Abraham addresses in the singular when he's through in verse 3, and then switches to the plural at times. So there's still, even in Abraham's speech, he's sometimes talking to the one, sometimes talking to the multiple. But I think that is part of when she's afraid. I mean, that is showing something about the Lord's identity is sort of being revealed even in the way people are reacting. I mean, Abraham's just showing hospitality, and doing a great job with showing hospitality, even bowing down to the ground, that might hint at, but you might do that to somebody you're just who's a superior. So anyway, there is this kind of revelation that this is the Lord for the characters and for the readers. David, I saw you on mute earlier. Were you gonna say something?
Just kind of sharing from my experience. I didn't have a lot of observations, mainly being in the car. I didn't have the text open, of course, before me.
Yeah.
And so it was difficult. I was only able to pick out a few words that I knew. There was probably more words that I knew I was supposed to know that I didn't than words that I actually knew. But I can see the value even in just that, just learning to hear it and learning to try to recognize. And so I appreciate it. And I hope in the future to be already in my office so that I can have the text open. Yeah. And I think that would help a little bit. Yeah.
Well, we're only made it halfway through the chapter, so we're going to read the second half in a minute. But yeah, having the text in front of you will probably be helpful. And even then, no doubt there will be some words that we all think we ought to know, but we don't. And this is a guilt-free zone. It's anxiety-free. I know learning Hebrew involves a lot of anxiety sometimes, but this is not the place for that. Good. Are there any? Yeah, Marisa.
Looking at verse 12, is there anything that you see in the text which weights her thought toward her versus Abraham?
You mean, so Sarah laughed within her saying, after the little t is Bala is to be worn out. It's my being worn out. It's the infinitive construct. Has there been to me, it's perfect, but has there been to me pleasure? And my master, Adoni, is old. So I know I just retranslated it and didn't answer your question. But can you kind of rephrase it? Sarah is speaking, right? But what do you mean by the Abraham part of it?
In the words that she's chosen or the way the sentence is constructed, is there anything here that would indicate she gives more weight to her being old
Yeah. I
or
see.
more weight to Abraham being old?
Yeah, it's interesting because what she most plainly talks about Abraham being old. Of course, she is referring to her old age in some sense, but in verse 12, it's varoni zaken. Although then in verse 14, she says ani zakanti, and I am old. So you kind of have actually these verses first pointing to Abraham, then pointing to herself. So maybe equal parts, but in verse 12, Abraham seems to be the main reason. I mean, the story clearly, I mean, this is kind of maybe obvious, but the story clearly really wants us to get that they are old and that they're past the time of having children. So they have no reason to expect a child, even though God has promised it. And, you know, the whole drama of the Abraham-Sarah narrative is them waiting for it. And now it hasn't happened, and now it seems like it's too late. So God's going to do is, and then you have this question: is anything too difficult or too wonderful for Yahweh? That's verse 14. That seems to be kind of the sermon in this text. Is anything too wonderful or too difficult for the Lord? Okay. Any other questions or observations before we pick it back up in verse 16? We are entering into the Sodom and Gomorrah story, so which will continue all the way through 19. So we'll be doing that next week, but this is really the prelude to all of this. Okay, everybody ready? Verse 16. Vayakumu misham ha'anashim, vayashkifu al panei Sodom, va'avraham holech imam, v'shalacham. Varonai amar, hamechase ani me Avraham, asher ani oseh, va'avraham hayo yihye Lagoy gadol ba'atzum, v'nivrachu vo kol goye haaretz. Verse 19. Ki yedativ lama'an asher yitzaveh et banav ve'et beito acharav, v'shamaru derech Adonai la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. Lama'an havi Adonai al Avraham et asher diber alav. Stopping there, so back to 16. And they got up from there, the men got up from there, and they looked out over Sodom. So it's upon the face of, but they looked out over Sodom. And now Avraham was going with them to send them off. And Yahweh said, it's interesting here, by the way, just so you don't have the Vayiktol, the Vayomer Adonai, that's what you'd sort of expect, but you have Amar, and he said, so it's like a break in some way. But I think this is because this is God talking to himself, which is interesting, right? We have like Sarah earlier talking to herself, and now we have clearly the Lord has an inner dialogue. And Yahweh said, should I conceal from Avraham what I am doing? And Avraham will certainly be a great and mighty nation. And all the earth, or all the nations of the earth, will be blessed by him. In verse 19, for I know him, so that he will it could be it should be I have known him, so that he will command his sons and his household after him, and they will keep the way of Yahweh by doing tzedakah and mishpat, righteousness and justice. So that this is the bringing of Yahweh upon Abraham, but so that Yahweh might bring upon Abraham what he had spoken about him. Okay, verse 20. Now we're back to Vayomer. Vayomer Adonai, Tza'akat Sodom va'Amorah ki rabba, v'chatatam ki chavada ma'od. Verse 21. Erada na ve'er ha'ketzakata haba'a elav or elai asu kala ve'im lo eda'a. Verse 22. Vayifnu misham ha'anashim ve'yelechu Sodoma. Avraham odenu omed lifnei Adonai. Okay, translating. It's a short section here, verse 20. Yahweh said, the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah, surely it is great. The keys are emphatic here. Surely it's great. And their sin, surely it is severe, very severe. I will go down, or maybe let me go down, so that I might see, and it's literally, this is a question, the hey interrogative, is it according to its outcry that has come to me that they have acted altogether? In other words, God is saying, I'm going to go down and see if what I hear matches what I see on the ground. I'm hearing an outcry. I'm going to go see if what they're doing matches with what I'm hearing. Okay. And if not, I will know. And in verse 22, they turned from there, the men turned from there and they went to Sodom. And Avraham, he remained standing before the Lord. So a differentiation between the men and the Lord. Verse 23. Vayigash Avraham vayomar, ha'af tispeh tzadik im rasha. Verse 24. Ulai yesh chamishim tzadikim, b'tok ha'ir, ha'af tispeh v'lo tisa, lamakom lama'an chamishim. Hatzadikim asher bekirba, chalila lecha me asot, kadavar hazeh lahamit tzadik im rasha, v'haya chatzadik karasha, chalila lach hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Okay, I'm trying to give a little emphasis to the tone that I hear in Moses here. He's talking God into something. So back to translating in verse 23. And Abraham drew near and he said, will you really wipe away the righteous with the wicked? This is a theodicy. Is God just? Text. Perhaps there are 50 righteous people in the midst of the city. Will you really wipe away and not spare or lift up that place, but to spare the place on account of 50 righteous people who are in its midst? Chalila is far be it. So far be it from you to do according to this, to kill the righteous with the wicked. Will it be as with the righteous, so with the wicked? Far be it from you. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? Verse 26. Vayomer Adonai, im emtsa visdom chamishim tzadikim. This, by the way, I'm reading to the end of the chapter, so bear with me. Lots of repetition, lots of numbers, okay? I'm going to start on verse 26. Vayomer Adonai, im emtsa visdom chamishim tzadikim, betok ha'ir, benasati l'chol hamakom ba'avuram. Vaya'an Avraham vayomar, hine na ho'alti lidaber el Adonai, va'anochi afar va'ether. Verse 28, ulai yachsurun chamishim hatzadikim chamisha hatashchit bachamisha et kol ha'ir, vayomer lo ashchit im emtsa sham arba'im v'chamisha. Verse 29, vayosef od lidaber elav vayomar, ulai yimatsun sham arba'im. Vayomer lo e'eseh ba'avur ha'arba'im. Vayomer al na yichar ladonai ba'adabera. Ulai yimatsun sham shaloshim. Vayomer lo e'eseh im emtsa sham shaloshim. Verse 31. Vayomer hine na ho'alti lidaber el Adonai, ulai yimatsun sham esrim. Vayomer lo ashchit ba'avur ha'esrim. Verse 32. Vayomer al na yichar ladonai ba'adabara ach hapa'am, ulai yimatsun sham asara. Vayomer lo ashchit ba'avur ha'asara. In verse 33, vayelech Adonai ka'asher kila lidaber el Avraham, va'Avraham shav limkomo. All right, now we're going back to 26 for translating. And Yahweh said, if I find in Sodom, did I skip something? Nope. Right, that's where we picked up. Yahweh said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous people in the midst of the city, I will spare all the place on account of them. Verse 27, and Avraham answered, and he said, look, a whole alti could be like, I have decided, but it's probably more deferential. I have determined to speak to my Lord, even though I am dust and ashes. I'm taking a risk here. Perhaps the 50 will be lacking. The 50 righteous people will be lacking 5, chamisha. Will you destroy on account or on because of 5? Will you destroy all the city on account of 5? And he said, I will not destroy if I find there 45. And he continued to speak to him, and he said, perhaps 40 will be found there. And he said, I will not act on account of the 40. And he said, do not let it be, it's usually translated, do not let my Lord be angry, but it's do not let it be angry to my Lord. Let not my Lord be angry, so that I might speak. Perhaps 30 will be found there. And he said, I will not act if I find there 30. And he said, look, I have determined to speak to my Lord. Perhaps 20 will be found there. And he said, I will not destroy on account of the 20. And he said, do not be angry, Lord, so that I might speak only one more time, hapa'am, one more time. Perhaps 10 will be found there. And he said, I will not destroy on account of the 10. And the Lord went just as he finished to speak to Abraham. So he went away, and Abraham returned to his place. All right, this ends the chapter 18, the negotiation between Abraham and Yahweh. I always find these negotiations interesting. It makes me think of like Exodus 32 and 33, where God is determined to destroy them. Moses is appeasing and persuading God to relent. And it's similar. In some ways, the stories have a similar function to show God's long-suffering character. And really, there's a big justice issue here that the chapter makes it so clear. Will God not act with justice? You know, this question that in order to depict Sodom as utterly just sinful, their sin, their cry, their actions, and 19 will only add to this. Okay, so what questions or observations did you make as we went along in the second half of 18?
You mentioned some emphatic keys, and I was wondering, is that a contextual clue, or is there something else that tips you off that those are emphatic?
Yeah, so that's in verse 20. So you probably, if you've learned key by default as like because or that, causal, that's the normal use. However, it's relatively common, it's not the most normal, to have key being sort of a particle of emphasis, and that it is a contextual decision. So in this case, Yahweh said, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, it doesn't make any sense because it's great. That might make actually some sense, but their sin, because it is so severe, it's not finished. There's no like second part of that. So there's usually taken to be emphatic how great it is. How, it's so great. Their sin, it's so severe, or it's so heavy. So there's certainly lots of text where key is used that way. Although I usually would say default, try the causal sense, and if it doesn't work, then think of some other use of key.
And I just had one other question. I could use a reminder on the particle na. I saw that a couple different 2 or 3 times. What exactly does that do? I've learned it before, but I couldn't remember.
Yeah, good question. So there's 2 different types of verbs. You have indicative verbs that are like perfect or imperfect, where this will happen, this will not happen, or this happens, a statement of fact. Then you have volitional verbs that are like imperatives or jussives, let it be this way, or do this, or and na is usually appears after volitional verbs. And some would say that it means please, or some sort of symbol of politeness, which actually would work in this text because Abraham is talking to God. And so there's this kind of clear hierarchy, but na doesn't work as a symbol of or a sign of politeness in a lot of other texts. So it's best just left untranslated, which means we don't know exactly what it means,
Okay.
except that it regularly occurs with these volitional verbs.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure, good questions. Other questions or observations? Benji?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, I was thinking, or just thinking about the cry coming up to Yahweh and how that kind of parallels to the beginning of Exodus. And, but I was just making that connection. And then, like, as the story went on for this, just seeing how there weren't really any righteous people, well, I guess, as we'll see in the next chapter. But I guess just wondering, like, what that cry is, and
Yeah.
is it similar to the cry of the Israelites in Egypt?
Yeah, it's the same dynamic where a cry comes up to God and then God comes down to see, which may not quite fit with our understanding of who God is, but it's a regular, it definitely fits with the theology here of God finding something out. And same thing in Exodus, of course, dramatically different in other ways than Exodus, where the outcry is one of a people who are oppressed. And it seems like the outcry here, it's paralleled with their sin, chata. So it's like some sort of God hears about their sin. In some ways, it reminds me of Exodus 32, when Moses is up on the mount. I don't know if it uses this language, but Moses is up on the mountain, and the people are down carousing around the golden calf, and they hear the noise from afar, and then they have to go, and they're a little, it's like not certain what the cry is. Was it a cry of war? Is it a cry of victory or loss, or what it is? In some ways, it's like that, where an outcry comes to God, and he's going to go see if. But God evidently interprets the outcry here as one of like cries of violence or cries of sin in some way, which is different than the cry of oppression. Maybe it could be the same. It could be the innocent crying out to God because of the violence they're experiencing. It's just, who are the innocent in Sodom, right? So Sodom and Gomorrah. So it seems to be more like a cry of the sin itself is crying out. It might also be like Cain and Abel's story, where the blood of Abel is crying out from the ground, right? Job will say, don't cover my blood, because he wants this testimony of innocence to come up to God. So it's a pretty regular motif then to have innocence coming up to God. The psalmists seem to be doing this even as they're crying out to God to pay attention. Why are you hiding yourself? Look at me. See the oppression that's been done to me. So in some ways the dynamic is similar. In other ways, because of the character of Sodom, it's a bit different. And there's this whole theological discussion I'm sure we could go on and pick out about the openness of God. Does God know the future, God in time, and so on? That's sort of a systematic theological conversation. That's a good conversation to have. These stories just, I think, are not overly concerned with that, and they assume that God is going to find something out. So he's going to go look so that I will know. And if not, then I'll know. Like, if this isn't a cry of violence, then I'll know about it.
I think whenever I think about this, it sort of makes me think of the personal nature of God in many regards. And I'm thinking back to the garden, right? He's walking and he says, Adam, where are you?
Right.
Almost like you would call a little kid. Like, you know what you did, and I know what you did, but let's talk about this, kind of a thing. And he goes and finds them. Mm-hmm. He knew what had happened. And I suspect there may be a sort of an overtone of that here, where it's not that he doesn't know per se, but I appreciate that he's like, I'm gonna go myself in the flesh, so to speak, and be among the people and find out. And ultimately, I come back to Jesus again. It's like, that's largely what he did. In the flesh, I went and was among my own people. I know what it's like. And I think there's something there that's, in some regards, is kind of beautiful, but
Right.
I don't know. It's personal at the very least.
It may be perhaps important that Yahweh is embodied in a person here, right? And he is that person. Well, two of the people who are associated with Yahweh will go to Sodom and actually take a look, like in an incarnated form. They're not Yahweh. When we get to 19, we'll kind of consider who they are. But yeah, that's good. Marisa, you had your hand up a little while ago. I didn't want to miss out on your question or observation.
I did. There were two things. One, they relate somewhat on it. Dusty was talking about God coming and looking at the person. So often when I look at what's said, I view through the eyes of parent.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever had a child or ever had to deal with small children, coming back to you and asking the same question over and over.
Yeah.
Until, you just like, because that's it, just because I said so, that's it, let's be done with it. And here, the questioning repeats, but it's like there's also, by using very much similar wording each time, that is emphasizing that repetition. But it's almost, and this is something I thought of from what Dusty was saying, God can keep saying, okay, sure, this many, now a little less, yeah, sure, a little less, sure, because he knows that you're not even going to get 20. That's
right.
With his knowledge, he already knows that's a foregone conclusion, but he's sort of, the word I had just disappeared. He's
certain.
He's taking what Abraham says because he already knows it's a foregone conclusion of what they're doing.
Right. Yes, he does clearly know about Sodom well. And yes, the repetition is important for a lot of reasons. I think it shows that, like, I don't know, this scene is not God being persuaded perhaps as much as some other scenes, but there are texts that, where God is persuaded, like I mentioned, Exodus 32. But here, a good illustration with children where there's like this negotiation between non-equal parts. But the way that Abraham appeals to God and like kind of tries to persuade God is perhaps important. I hadn't thought about it until you were speaking. You may have one other thing I don't want to miss out on, but when God is talking to himself where it's starting in verse 17, where he's saying, should I tell Abraham about what I'm about to do? Right. And he says, well, yeah, I know him. I have known him. And I know about Abraham that he's going to teach his kids. He's going to teach his household tzedakah and mishpat. He's going to teach him justice. And then the story right after it is Abraham appealing to God's sense of mishpat and tzedakah, justice and righteousness. It's like, will you wipe away the tzedakah, the righteous, the tzaddikim, with the rasha, the wicked? And it's like God taught Abraham about justice, and now Abraham is saying, you're not going to act unjustly, are you? And it's like this really it's clearly the issue of this. But that's a similar, it's still, Abraham is always deferential in the way that he's talking to God, but he's also bold. Like, I'm determined, I'm going to go for it and see what's happening. And then God just sort of, with this really clear repetition, I will not act against them for 40, for 30, for 10. Yeah. Did you have one other thing, or is that?
That was it.
Okay,
But
that's good.
in a way, that's interesting what you said, because God looks and says he will teach them about, and then Abraham allows him into what follows is something that's going to emphasize that in Abraham's mind, that
Yes.
quality.
Yeah. That's right. And good. All right. We have just a couple more minutes. Is there any other question or observation? John?
Yeah, I have a question. So this is one of those texts, one of those probably many texts from Genesis where the average reader reading the Old Testament will get tripped up because it's so foreign. You know, what's the deal going on here with these three men?
Yeah.
You know, they're supposed to be the Lord. What's going on here? And I
Right.
think it contributes to people being scared off from reading the Old Testament because it's just so foreign. You know, I don't understand it.
Right.
Is the reader today supposed to have some tension here when they get to this, you know, these texts like this, where there's so much distance between
Right.
the reader and what's going on? Or is some of that kind of confusion, is that part of the strategy here, you know?
Yeah, I do think there's intention, in narrative intention behind sort of the mysterious nature of Yahweh, and this will carry out through Genesis. I always think of like Genesis 32, where Jacob wrestles the man, and
Yeah.
it turns out Jacob discovers that he's been wrestling with God, but he doesn't know that at the beginning. At some point in this story, perhaps Abraham realizes that he's talking to God. But at first, he's just showing hospitality. But obviously, in the second half of the story, he's dealing with when God reveals, and the two leave and the one stay. But the ambiguity, it seems intentional, even in Abraham talking in the singular at the beginning, but then in the plural, rest yourselves, seems to recognize there's this one leader of the three who perhaps is the speaker. And maybe, I don't know what the clue is into this being God, but maybe he knows what's going on in Sarah's heart. Maybe that's part of it. But I do think, for whatever reason, the narrative, the people are learning who God is in these stories. They don't always realize it. And God is embodied in just looks like a person. The angel of the Lord, we might call it that, but even in like Genesis 32, it's the angel of the man, the angel of the Lord, and then God. So it's all of these things. So yeah, I think the ambiguity is purposeful, and just so it begs the question, well, why? Like, why does the story want to be so unclear about this?
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, that's helpful. Do you know if there are any parallel texts to this, like outside of Israel, Hebrew, and other,
like negotiating with God stories?
Yeah, or you know, a God coming in three persons like this?
Not off the top of my head. I think the idea of a God being sort of embodied in human form, I mean, we know that story well, but as far as I'm aware, we don't have in the ancient Near East. You have like demigods like Gilgamesh or something, who's like part human and part God, but not like this, where, I mean, at the end of this story, Yahweh goes away, or maybe, and he's coming up and going down. So it's like this, although we have it common enough in the Genesis stories, it's really, even after the patriarchal stories, we don't see it very often. I'm thinking about, maybe y'all can correct me, even within the Bible, you don't have like an embodiment of God. The best book on this is Benjamin Summers' book, The Bodies of God. He talks about this as sort of a predecessor for even like Trinitarian ideas and the incarnation and so on. But he would talk about like the glory of God seems to be a substantive presence of God in the Exodus narrative, where it's kind of coming down on the mountain and then going into the tabernacle. But he deals with these texts. I don't remember any ancient Near Eastern parallels.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, our time is up. So I definitely want to try to stick to the hour. I mean, it's in the title, story hour, but if you want to hang out after this, you're welcome to with me. Thank you for your attention. Next week, we'll be picking up with chapter 19. It's a long and interesting story, Sodom and Gomorrah. So look forward to having you back with us. And if I'll just say lastly, if you're new, really glad you were here, even if you've been around. I'm interested in feedback. We're kind of getting this thing off the ground. I do hope like in the future to have guest readers who it wouldn't be a big ask to read a chapter and translate for us, but kind of figuring things out before we get to that point. So anyway, let me know if I can, if you have any suggestions, and please spread the word to your fellow Hebrew enthusiasts or just Bible readers. Okay. Adonai imachem.
Thank you.
You're welcome, everybody.
And bye-bye.